What's up, YouTube? This is HT, aka Higher Thinking, here to remind you to please stop at Dr. Claud Anderson's YouTube channel and watch his videos, right? Watch it unsnipped and unclipped and show some support, man. Stop at the comment section and just leave some roses because he deserves it, right? He's dedicated his entire life to being a warrior for a disenfranchised group of people. And that his work is not ending with him. That remind him that he's cultivated the next generation of warriors that's willing to continue the fight that he's left off on, right? So please stop by and show him some love. And in the meantime, enjoy this video.
Couldn't find one person that could explain what racism was. Because they use the definitions that are being perpetuated by the dominant white society. But let's find out what racism and track it. Let's go back in history now. In about 1450, there was no such thing as a race. What they had in those days, they had tribes, they had religious groups, and they had nations. That was it. But about 1445 to 1450, at that particular time, a guy named Henry the Navigator went off the coast of Africa, and he picked up about 16 blacks and took them back to Portugal and to Italy. And he got back there, he gave them to the Catholic Church as a gift and suggested they can use them however they saw fit. And they used the Catholic Church. The reason they gave him to the Catholic Church, you see, was because prior to that time, the Catholic Church sort of played the role of being an advocate and a consoler for people who were slaves. Because to be a slave in that time, you know, you had to, again, as I said, be persecuted for being either for indebtedness or for religious persecution or a victim of a war, prisoner of war. And so the Catholic Church was playing the role of being a great consoler, come in and comfort you. And so when Henry the Navigator gave those 16 blacks to the Catholic Church in about 1445, 1450, they kept them and used them. What we do, we use them as slaves, as servants in the Catholic Church. And they used them in that role from about 1445, 1450 up until about 1488. And in 1488, a guy named Pope Innocent, he says, you know, we found out over this 40-something year period, having these blacks around, that's a good thing because we never had them before. As I said before, to be a slave, you had to be either indebted to someone or religiously being persecuted or prisoner of war. But these were neither of those things. So they said, well, this is a good thing. And so at that point in time, they injected the word race into race popped up. Not necessarily at that point, but around that point. And by saying, okay, what we're going to do now is just use them in any capacity we could. And so by the early 1500s, it was a major thing was going on across the world. And starting in Europe, they were suffering from famine, diseases, food shortages, and crime. And they needed to do something to resuscitate the entire European continent. And they were looking for a hope. So when Columbus came back and said, I found all this land, and it's uninhabited. That's when racism started, right there. It picked up, going all the way back to Henry the Navigator up to this point. Racism started at that point. How did it start? Because then they said, you know what? We need to go inhabit that land and try to use it that has value. But how are we going to do it? People said, well, remember what Pope Innocent said back in 1487? Let's use those people called blacks. Use them as a labor class, and we're going to change the whole concept of how to get wealth and power and save this continent. The entire European continent was going down the toilet. It's what we do then. We'll combine things instead of.
Yeah, it really was. Wasn't it? Was that not around the time and all that the Black Death and all that stuff and all these wild diseases that was happening?
Being practicing mercantilism as we've been doing up to this point in time. Let's come up with a new concept and where you can own and control, get the land, get the tools and the resources, and use someone else's labor and then enrich yourself. That becomes capitalism, and that's where some concept of capitalism started. But let's go back to the concept about race. So a race started. 9 European nations, France, Germany, the rest of them said they got into a race. So let's try to see who can be the first one to get over in those countries to North America, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, and use black labor to enrich ourselves. They were in a race to develop wealth and power by going and extracting the resources out of America or owning and controlling the land and the tools and using black labor to enrich themselves. That's where race came. That was a race. A race is a contest. They began to compete. That's why you heard me say on a number of occasions before, learning how to compete. And as they began to compete as nations, they competed from about the early 1500s all the way up until about 1857, right on the eve of the Civil War. And that's when the race ended. The race ended. That was a 300-year. The race ended then. You know why it ended? Because at that point in time, those European nations who had all pitched in together, as well as some Asian nations and Latin America, they had pitched in together to exploit black labor. And all the resources have been transferred into the hands of non-blacks.
Yep.
And the race was over in 1859.
The origin story of the word race.
And when the race ended, they took the E off of race and stuck a suffix called ISM, which means sustain and hold on to the prevailing conditions.
Yeah.
At that particular time in 1859, whites owned almost 99% of everything in America, and black slaves owned practically nothing. You had about almost 4.5 to 5 million slaves, but they owned practically nothing. And the only people, and the few blacks that had gotten something was you had about 200-some thousand blacks that were free. Collectively, they had 1/2 of 1% of anything of value.
Yep.
At that point in 1859, the race ended, and they took the E off of race and stuck the suffix ISM. That's where racism came from. It had nothing to do with minorities and poor folk and people of color.
Yep.
It had to do strictly with black people and whites, which means all the wealth and resources and land, ownership, rights, privileges, businesses, income, had all been transferred into the hands of the dominant white society. And consequently, from that point on, whites would own and control everything in the country, and that was what racism was. At any time black folk asked for anything, for reparations or affirmative action or any preferential treatment or anything, you sort of be in an opposition to it. But what's happening now, to keep black folk confused, they want to pretend that racism also is the same as bias, bigotry, hatred, personal attitudes, or discrimination.
Yeah.
Those things have nothing to do with everybody discriminates. Even in a family, you can discriminate, but you can have 5 kids and discriminate between them. That has nothing to do with racism.
Yeah.
And see, black folk must learn that and understand that black people can never be racist. All they can do in America is react to white racism.
Yeah. So, a lot of other people would just kind of simply say, we're not supposed to be bigoted or discriminate based on color of skin and stuff like that. That's what folks would like. That's like the typical, narrative, regarding what people's perception of racism is. In order for them to convey their message as effectively as possible, I believe that part of empathy, right, is inserting yourself into their world, into their world view, So when Dr. Claud Anderson comes in and spins this unique approach on the understanding of racism that is deeply rooted in the totality of his research, this is what he found what racism is, But what I'm learning to do is taking his idea of racism and applying it to when he speaks. And when I'm speaking to other people that have not been exposed to Dr. Claud Anderson's work and stuff like that, I have to remind myself to, okay, this person sees racism like this. He sees it as discrimination, this and this and that. And then when I speak to another person, they may say, oh, well, the person that'll say black people can't be racist. You know what I mean? I'll have to understand what he means by racism. Like, what do you mean by racism? If you look at dictionary.com, you'll actually see that racism and racist have 2 completely different meanings now. I had a really big, thick red dictionary back, growing up, and I looked up the word racism or racist and all that stuff, and it said the belief that one's own ethnic background is superior to all others. Kyrie Irving shared a tweet, you know what I mean? And then the Jewish people came and said, oh no, take it like we fire this guy, you know what I mean? These guys can change things, you know what I mean? They take a black guy out of his job because they didn't like what he tweeted, you know what I mean? So that's the type of racism that black people don't have access to. Now we can be discriminatory. If I don't explain somebody that Dr. Claud Anderson's view on what racism is different than what their perception of racism is, it can completely screw up the entire conversation. You as a speaker, you have full responsibility to fully articulate your thoughts and opinions. It's your job to speak coherently and correctly. No matter what the other person's background is, and you have to be empathetic enough to understand what context you're gonna have to explain before speaking out, right? And of course, always look out for the people that listen in bad faith. Those people exist also.
Blacks don't have the power to enslave, Jim Crow, segregate, or mistreat anybody in America.
Yeah, there we go.
Racism is an issue between blacks and whites. It has nothing to do with language groups or culture groups or other groups coming to America.
Race and nationality is two very different things. Even by definition, it's two very different things. It's just that people don't really apply that. Right. They don't apply that, and then when if somebody were to be discriminatory against a Mexican, the Mexican person will deem that racist, right? However, that's not racism according to Dr. Claud Anderson. That's being discriminatory. So, but if it's to do a race, then race is primarily skin color. It's skin color, but I believe he might correct me though, because it might mean foundational Black Americans,
Black people, blacks and whites. And so now that you understand racism, be on the guard. Don't let anybody use those terms in front of you to confuse it and mix it with things that don't pertain to black folk.
Yeah.
White folks started misusing the word race after 1859 and told black folk it has to do with how you feel about somebody, right, and whether you like them or not. Racism started off as an economic issue between blacks and whites. It is still an economic issue between blacks and whites.
When he says they're going to misuse the term racism to confuse blacks into thinking that it's about how you feel and stuff like that, I definitely know what he means. This is something that's kind of bold, true. It's like an inclusivity thing. It's like they like to use this trauma Olympics. You know what I mean? They want to say who are your black folk are always participating in trauma, the trauma Olympics on who suffered the worst and all this other stuff. It's not even the case. It's not even necessarily the case with us. Like we're just 99% of the time we're literally just exclaiming like what happened to us, and we want justice, you know. And it's like and other people, and it's, you know, to their dismay, like it's really them enacting that upon us. So for the first rebuttal you hear when we start talking about reparations and stuff like that, bringing that conversation up, they talk about, well, what about all the other people that haven't received reparations over their slavery? You know, there was slavery going on in Africa. Like all these whataboutism arguments that is not conducive toward a solution to what black folks are experiencing in America today. You know what I mean? Like we're bringing up, hey, we have a grievance, right? We have a grievance that's rooted in history, facts, and all that stuff. But like the only thing they can come up with is a whataboutism argument. We got new leaders. First, it was abolitionists. Then there was this, Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement and Malcolm X. Then it was NAACP. Then it was BLM and all that stuff. And then it's just social justice warriors today, you know. And it's like, I'm just saying, like these conversations aren't new. So what makes you why are you still trying to assume that these people are like something wrong with their head or anything like that? Isn't these conversations not new? They've heard the arguments from both sides, and they're still standing firm on these dog crap talking points. So it's not, they're not stupid. They're actually they're looking out for their best. They're looking out for the best interests of their own race. That's what this video is kind of emblematic of. Is racism. They are participating in racism. Why? Because they want to remain they want their group to remain as the dominant society.